Atlantic Ocean, 1942. German U-boats are tearing Allied convoys apart. Something fails in the dark, and men realize too late that trust can kill faster than the enemy. Because what was meant to protect them turns silent and weak at the exact moment survival demands perfection, shattering the confidence they carried into the mission. They were promised safety, they were promised control, they were promised that this would work, but when the moment arrives, the promise vanishes without warning or mercy, leaving only the cold understanding that the danger is no longer outside. It is embedded in what they were told to rely on. What failed that night was not courage or discipline. It was a fleet of wooden ships rushed into war against steel. Orders still echo and discipline holds, yet beneath that surface something is already cracked. Because this failure is not a surprise to everyone. Somewhere far from the fear and the noise, someone had already sensed this coming. Not clearly, not loudly, just enough to hesitate and then stay silent, just enough to move forward anyway. And now lives hang on that silence, balanced between obedience and consequence, forcing a question that cannot be escaped or answered easily. When you know something can fail, and you send men into it anyway, what does that decision truly say about the mission itself? The convoy does not slow when it enters the danger zone, because slowing would admit fear, and fear is something these ships were never meant to show. So they press on through rolling black water, while the night closes in like a lid, stars swallowed by cloud, the horizon erased until sea and sky become the same hostile void. Lookouts grip railings with numb hands, scanning for shapes that never announce themselves, listening for sounds that never come in time, while engines hum steadily beneath wooden decks that vibrate with effort and strain. Then the first sign is not an explosion, but confusion. An order that hesitates, a signal that does not travel cleanly, a sense that coordination is slipping just enough to be noticed. A ship on the edge of formation drifts slightly offline. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would justify alarm, except that in this ocean, small separations are invitations. The warning shout arrives half a second too late, torn from a throat already tight with dread, as a violent surge of water erupts beside the hull, and the night flashes white with fire. Wood splinters instead of screaming, tearing open in jagged sheets as flames race across the surface, and the ship lurches, wounded but not yet dead, its crew thrown into chaos they were trained never to show. Orders come fast now, overlapping, sharp, desperate to restore shape to something already collapsing. But the ocean does not wait for clarity, and the enemy does not announce intent. Another ship shudders as a shockwave slams through its side, knocking men to their knees, ripping open compartments never meant to face this kind of force, and suddenly the realization spreads faster than the fire. These ships cannot absorb punishment the way they were supposed to. They burn too easily, break too quickly, and respond too slowly to a threat that moves unseen beneath them. Men fight instinctively to control damage, hauling hoses, sealing hatches, dragging wounded bodies through smoke that tastes like oil and panic, while the sea fills with debris and screams that vanish almost as soon as they rise. Somewhere in the dark, another shape moves, unseen but felt, and the convoy reacts not as a single unit but as frightened fragments, each ship trying to survive the next minute instead of the mission. Searchlights snap on and off, stabbing uselessly into water that offers no answers, while guns fire at shadows that are already gone, recoil thudding through wooden frames that were never meant to bear this stress again and again. A second explosion rips through the night, closer this time, and ship lists hard, deck tilting as flames climb its superstructure, and men slide toward the rail, realizing too late that escape routes are already blocked. Training holds them together just long enough to keep the ship afloat. But faith is gone now, replaced by raw calculation and fear they were never supposed to feel. This is the instant when the mission breaks, not because of cowardice or confusion, but because the tools they were given cannot keep up with the reality pressing in from all sides. The ocean becomes a trap instead of a passage, the formation a liability instead of protection, and every man aboard understands that something fundamental has failed. They were not overwhelmed by numbers. They were not outmatched by courage. They were betrayed by expectations that collapse under pressure, and as burning ships drift apart in the dark Atlantic, the truth settles in with terrifying clarity. This was not an unlucky encounter. This was the exact moment when belief met reality and reality won. This was never meant to be a gamble, and that belief mattered more than anything else, because the Navy did not introduce these ships as an experiment or a desperate guess, but as an answer delivered with urgency and confidence at the same time. They were presented as a solution to a problem that was bleeding lives faster than steel could be forged, a way to flood the ocean with protection when traditional strength could not arrive quickly enough. The idea was simple, almost comforting in its logic. If the sea was too vast to guard with a few powerful ships, then it would be filled instead with many smaller ones, visible, present, and constant, turning empty stretches of water into watch territory. These vessels were meant to be reassuring, not intimidating, steady escorts that would make convoys feel less alone and enemies feel less invisible. The expectation was not that they would dominate the ocean, but that they would deny it to the unseen threat beneath the surface, forcing hesitation where confidence once ruled. In briefings and conversations, they were described as practical, efficient, and reliable enough to do the job that needed doing right now, not later, not when conditions were ideal, but in the middle of crisis where delay meant loss. Their speed of construction was celebrated as ingenuity rather than compromise, proof that industry and willpower could outpace destruction if pushed hard enough. Crews were told they were sailing on ships that represented adaptation, that symbolized a navy refusing to be paralyzed by limitations, and that belief mattered deeply to men sent into darkness night after night. The plan assumed that presence itself would change behavior, that the enemy would think twice before striking when escorts appeared more frequently, when silhouettes multiplied on the horizon, when the ocean felt less empty. These ships were expected to patrol, to respond, to give warnings, to create enough friction to disrupt attacks before they fully formed. They were supposed to be predictable in a way that created stability, dependable in a way that allowed merchant crews to breathe just a little easier. But what the incident exposed was not a small flaw in execution, it was a fundamental collision between expectation and reality, because the conditions these ships were sent into were never patient, never forgiving, and never static. The sea did not care that they were meant to reassure, and the enemy did not hesitate simply because something floated above the water. In the chaos of a real encounter, speed of construction did not translate into strength under pressure, and visibility did not guarantee control. The expectation that numbers could compensate for vulnerability unraveled the moment sustained danger arrived, because repetition does not equal resilience, and presence does not equal protection when reaction time shrinks to seconds. These ships were expected to hold formation and project order, but instead they struggled to maintain cohesion when stress compounded, and the very simplicity that allowed them to exist in large numbers became a liability when coordination mattered most. The plan imagined these vessels as a bridge between vulnerability and safety, but the reality revealed them as something caught in between, neither expendable enough to lose without consequence nor strong enough to endure without cost. Watching them fail was not shocking, because the enemy was clever, but because the assumptions behind their deployment were fragile, built on urgency rather than certainty. The contrast is stark and unsettling. What was sold as control became exposure, what was framed as protection became risk, and what was meant to stabilize the situation instead introduced a new kind of instability. This was not a misunderstanding at the edge of the mission, but at its core, because the expectation was that these ships only needed to be good enough, and the ocean does not accept good enough when lives depend on it. In that gap between promise and performance, something dangerous takes shape, because once belief collapses, every decision that followed it becomes suspect, and the question shifts quietly but relentlessly from whether the plan failed to whether it ever truly understood the reality it was built to face. What happened that night refuses to stay isolated, because once the shock fades, the echoes begin to surface from other waters, other convoys, other moments where the same uneasy realization crept in too late, quietly stitching this incident into a larger, darker shape. Another patrol, different stretch of ocean, same uneasy confidence at the start, the same belief that presence would be enough, until contact turns brief and violent, and the response lags just long enough to matter. Again, a ship reacts instead of anticipates. Again, confusion spreads faster than clarity. Again, fire finds wood before orders find form. In each case, the sequence feels hauntingly familiar. Calm movement, sudden threat, a scramble to respond, and the dawning understanding that these ships are always one step behind the dangers circling them. Reports come back describing encounters that sound uncomfortably alike, where escorts arrive but cannot stay ahead of the threat, where warnings feel delayed even when they are technically on time, where survival depends less on protection and more on luck and improvisation. Crews begin to notice patterns they are not encouraged to name, moments where the same weaknesses surface under pressure, where similar decisions lead to similar outcomes, and where recovery always costs more than expected. Another convoy loses cohesion after a brief encounter, not because of panic, but because the escorts struggle to reassert order once it is disrupted, forcing merchant ships to fend for themselves longer than anyone planned. In yet another incident, damage control becomes a race against inevitability, with wooden structures giving way faster than crews can respond, turning what should have been manageable into something final. The repetition is not loud or dramatic at first. It accumulates quietly in after-action summaries, in conversations held just below official tone, in the tired eyes of men who recognize situations before they fully unfold. What makes it unsettling is not that failure occurs, but that it occurs in the same way, under similar conditions, producing the same narrow margins and the same kinds of losses. Each time, the explanation leans toward circumstance, toward weather, toward chance, toward the enemy's unpredictability, but the shape of the events refuses to change. The ships are present, yet always reacting. They are committed, yet always exposed. They are meant to deter, yet consistently drawn into moments where deterrence arrives too late to matter. As these incidents stack quietly behind the scenes, the idea that this was a singular bad night becomes harder to defend, because coincidence loses its credibility when it repeats itself with such discipline. The pattern does not announce itself with a declaration. It emerges through familiarity, through the growing sense that outcomes are being rehearsed rather than discovered. And once that recognition settles in, it transforms each new mission into a test not of courage, but of whether the same failure will arrive again, wearing a slightly different face. The danger is no longer just the enemy beneath the water, but the predictability of how these encounters unfold, because predictability belongs to systems, not accidents. By the time the pattern becomes impossible to ignore, it has already written itself into multiple nights, multiple reports, multiple lives, leaving behind an uncomfortable truth that cannot be undone. This keeps happening, and the cost is becoming harder to explain away. Long before these failures began to repeat themselves at sea, unease had already begun to surface in quieter places, away from burning decks and panicked radio calls, in rooms where concerns were lowered into careful language and doubts were wrapped in professionalism. Early tests raised questions that never fully went away, moments where performance felt inconsistent, where assumptions felt optimistic rather than proven, and where confidence required a little too much faith to sustain itself. Some reports hinted at limits that could not be ignored forever, phrased gently enough to avoid alarm but clear enough to suggest caution. Yet those warnings moved slowly through channels crowded with urgency and expectation. Letters were written, concerns logged, and doubts voiced in ways that sounded responsible rather than confrontational, but each one collided with the same pressure. The war could not wait, and solutions were needed now, not after reconsideration. The language of necessity softened the edges of warning, turning hesitation into something that could be deferred, reviewed later, or reinterpreted as acceptable risk. When issues were raised, they were rarely dismissed outright. Instead, they were absorbed into broader confidence, framed as manageable, or overshadowed by the visible success of rapid deployment. There was always another convoy leaving port, another mission that could not be delayed, another reason why stopping to question momentum felt more dangerous than proceeding without certainty. Over time, concern became background noise, present but no longer urgent, familiar enough to lose its power to interrupt. Even when patterns began to form, they were often compartmentalized, separated into individual incidents rather than recognized as connected signals pointing toward the same weakness. The structure meant to filter and prioritize information instead diluted it, spreading responsibility thin enough that no single warning carried enough weight to force change. What makes this moment unsettling is not that uncertainty existed. War thrives on uncertainty, but that doubt was acknowledged without being confronted, noted without being resolved. Decisions continued forward with awareness hovering just below the surface, creating a space where responsibility blurred into inevitability. This was not ignorance, and it was not deception in the loud sense, but a quieter choice to proceed while knowing that confidence was incomplete. Each ignored hesitation added another layer of distance between reality and belief, making it easier to justify the next mission and harder to pause long enough to listen. By the time the cost became visible on the ocean's surface, the warnings were no longer hypothetical, but the system that had absorbed them was already in motion, carrying decisions forward faster than reflection could catch up. In that space between knowing and acting, something fragile took hold, because once caution is acknowledged and set aside, the consequences no longer feel accidental, they feel inherited. The cost of these decisions is not measured in plans or reports, but in moments that unfold too fast for anyone to stop them, in the faces of men who realize the margin they were given is thinner than promised. Crews stand watch on decks that smell of salt and fuel, knowing now that if something goes wrong, there may be no second layer of protection, no hidden strength waiting to save them, only their own reactions and the mercy of the sea. When an attack comes, fear is not loud at first. It is focused, compressed into tight movements and controlled voices, into hands that shake only after the immediate danger has passed or not passed at all. Men fight fires that spread faster than expected, drag injured shipmates through smoke that burns the lungs and blinds the eyes, and make calculations they were never meant to make about who can be saved and who cannot. Some are thrown into the water, surrounded by debris and burning oil, clinging to wreckage while the convoy moves on because stopping would only multiply the loss. Others remain aboard ships that limp forward, damaged but afloat, knowing the same weakness could be tested again before dawn. Sleep becomes shallow and broken, filled with the memory of impacts and alarms, while daylight offers no comfort, only the exposure of open sea and the certainty that the next night will come. Letters home are written carefully, stripped of detail, carrying reassurances that feel thinner with every voyage, because explaining the truth would mean admitting how vulnerable they really are. For officers, the weight settles differently, in the knowledge that confidence must be maintained even as doubt grows heavier. That leadership now requires masking fear without lying outright. They watch younger men learn too quickly what the ocean can take, and they carry the quiet guilt of knowing that bravery alone cannot compensate for decisions made far from the deck. Each loss leaves behind an absence that does not show up on maps, an empty bunk, a missing voice, a routine that no longer includes someone who was there yesterday. These are not dramatic sacrifices framed by speeches, but abrupt endings that arrive without ceremony, cutting lives short in the middle of ordinary moments. What makes it harder to bear is the sense that these risks were not fully unavoidable, that the danger was not only external, but shaped by choices that placed men in positions where survival depended on luck more than design. Over time, the emotional toll accumulates, wearing down resolve not through cowardice, but through the constant strain of knowing that trust has limits. Missions continue because they must, but something fundamental has shifted, replacing belief with calculation and pride with endurance. In this space, courage becomes quieter and heavier, carried by men who do their duty knowing the cost may already be set before they ever see the enemy. This is where the story stops being about ships or strategies and becomes about the people who lived inside those decisions, because every failure leaves a mark that no report can fully record, and every choice echoes through lives that cannot be replaced once the sea closes over them. The story does not end with a correction or a clean turning point, because what unfolded in those waters resists closure, lingering instead as an uncomfortable presence that refuses to settle into a lesson neatly learned. Even as adjustments are whispered about and confidence slowly reshaped, the question remains suspended, heavy and unresolved, because acknowledging failure does not automatically undo the choices that allowed it to repeat. Somewhere between urgency and belief, a line was crossed where caution became optional, and once that line disappears, it becomes easier for similar decisions to follow, quieter and less visible each time. The ocean keeps its record without judgment, but institutions do not, and that difference matters, because what is not openly confronted tends to resurface in new forms. This was not the last moment where confidence outran certainty, and it would not be the last time lives were placed in the space between what was needed and what was truly ready. The unsettling part is not that mistakes happen in war, but that they can be absorbed, normalized, and folded into routine without ever being fully named. When urgency is allowed to override doubt and momentum replaces reflection, accountability becomes something that fades rather than sharpens. The men who live through these missions carry memories that do not align neatly with official confidence, fragments of nights where survival felt accidental rather than earned. Their experiences exist alongside records that move forward, leaving behind a quiet tension between what was seen and what was acknowledged. If this failure could be rationalized once, it raises a more disturbing possibility about how many others followed the same path, hidden by necessity and justified by outcome. The danger lies not only in the enemy that adapts and waits, but in the comfort of believing that adaptation alone is enough. Because when systems learn only after loss, the learning is never complete, and the cost is paid before understanding arrives. This story remains unfinished not because the war continued, but because the question it leaves behind has no easy answer. If confidence can carry decisions past their limits once, how many more times was the same choice made in silence? And how many of those moments are still waiting beneath the surface, unexamined, unseen, and dangerously familiar?